So I've had this idea for a while now, make my way through each of the mainline Final Fantasy games and describe my experience. Both of the game as it exists now and how I remember it, if I played it on release. The recent Pixel remasters have made this easier, so I think it's time. And before I start, I want to say that I'm completely aware that remasters aren't the original experience. I have access to quick saves and double speed, and the streamlined experience is much more friendly in 2021 than it was for the early games, especially the NES games. I'd also like to note that I never owned an NES or an SNES as a kid, so I was unable to play the American releases of Final Fantasy, though, as I'll go further into detail soon, I did watch a friend play, or Final Fantasy IV, 2 in the US. Final Fantasy VI, 3 in the US is an exception, and I'll get to why in that video. Also, because I don't have any previous experience with Final Fantasies 2 through 5, I'll probably combine the videos by pairs, so one video on 2 and 3 and one video on 4 and 5. I've heard 4 and 5 have rich stories though, so I may change my mind if I have a lot to say. While I never owned a Nintendo Entertainment System, several of my friends did, so I did have access to some of the classics, even though I never really was able to get good enough to beat them. To this day, I have never beat Super Mario Bros. 1 through 3, The Legend of Zelda 1 or 2, though I love to and still pick it up from time to time to try and beat it. I've reached the second to last boss, but I just can't seem to beat it. I've never beat Punch-Out or Castlevania, among others, but I've played and enjoyed them all. Also, I have always had a strong love of fantasy. I grew up with a father who loves The Lord of the Rings, and I myself love watching the film versions of Rankin Bass's The Hobbit and The Return of the King, and Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings, and reading fantasy, most notably in Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman's Dragonlance series, the Dragonlance Chronicles and the Dragonlance Legends. So when one friend of mine, Curtis, who I'll mention again in a later episode, gave another friend of mine, Rob, his copy of Final Fantasy, I salivated at the thought of creating your own party of heroes and battling dragons, wizards, and giants on an epic quest. I wouldn't be able to do that myself until the Sega Genesis's Dungeons & Dragons: The Warriors of the Eternal Sun and, most importantly, Shining Force, but I was at least able to watch Rob create his characters and make his way through the tale of crystals and time. I remember that Rob's party consisted of 2 fighters, a white mage and a black mage. Pretty boring, yes, but he had heard that this was the optimal party and I wanted to recreate that, so that's what I chose too. I don't remember the names he chose, but I do know his top fighter was Rex, so I duplicated that here as well. Since Final Fantasy was the first in a long line of games, and in a relatively new genre at that, I expected it to be quite simple by today's standard. Fight, defend, magic, items, and run are the options you have during battle, and most conversations are just a sentence or two. Your characters are also blank slates without any real opportunity to craft any type of backstory or personality for them. They're heroes, and several people thank them for their various actions, but there's no quote-unquote role-playing here. There's a path through the game, and that's it. And I remember thinking at the time that I wished the characters had backstories. It may have been the first time I thought critically of a game, and it was about a game I adored. Even so, I'm pretty sure young me would have been able to fill in those blanks. I distinctly remember, while playing Shining Force, crafting entire conversations and backstories and relationships between characters that only existed in my head. During battles, characters would plan and argue with each other. While the characters, as written, contained very little personality, my versions of the same characters were rich and varied. And so I'm pretty sure I would have been able to do the same for Final Fantasy. Playing Final Fantasy in 2021, I'm not sure how much exists that existed in the original version, but I remember being pleasantly surprised by how easy it was to find where I had to go next. There was always someone to guide me, and because dialogue was always so short, it never took too long to find my next destination. Until I got the airship, that is. After that, travel becomes a series of trial and error, and I was forced to look at guides for a few areas. 42-year-old me wonders how much of this was due to Nintendo Power, a subscription magazine that seemingly every NES owner subscribed to. First, the game hooked you, then made you rely on strategy guides from the magazine to finish the game. And it was these strategy guides that guided us, my friend Rob and others watching, through some of the more difficult dungeons, including a gauntlet of fire giants, I think, that ended in a room of chests filled with opal. I think maybe the name was changed to Diamond for the Pixel remaster, but I could be wrong on that. Armor. and one chest with a paltry sum of gil inside. I remember watching Rob play through this area into the early morning, and we all screamed in excitement upon receiving the 5 gil or however much it was, I'm sure waking his parents. Playing now, I'm surprised at how easy the game is, and I'm convinced that the difficulty of the original release was based more on RNG and, more importantly, an inability to save in dungeons. This meant that if you ran into a tough fight on the 5th floor of a dungeon and it wiped your party, you would have to complete the entire dungeon again. In 2021, the game autosaves at the start of a new floor, and quick saving is easy, so you'll never have to backtrack too much even if you die. Bosses are fairly simple, but I could see how stressful they could be in an instance where it could mean replaying the last couple hours over again. As it exists now, the only boss that gave me trouble was the final boss, Chaos. The story of the game has you traveling across the world to restore the light of the 4 elemental crystals your heroes are carrying from the beginning. You do this by defeating the 4 fiends: Lich, Earth; Kraken, Water; Merilith, Fire; and Tiamat, Air. There are other tasks to complete prior to reaching the temples and dungeons that hold these bosses, but mostly your task remains the same throughout the game. There is a little twist though, and I guess now is a good time to say that I predicted the twist while Rob was playing. This is not because I'm especially smart, and it's certainly not that the game gave clues about the twist before it came. Rather, I was looking at an issue of Nintendo Power, or maybe it was just a Final Fantasy strategy guide, and the image of Chaos, the final boss, was blacked out. For some reason, the image reminded me of Garland, the game's first boss. Because of this, I predicted that Garland was actually Chaos, and the 4 heroes, the Warriors of Light, would have to travel back in time to defeat him, thus making sure Garland never kidnapped the Princess of Cornelia, and so nobody would remember the Warriors of Light. It was interesting, and it certainly hit all our young brains as an example of exciting storytelling. And yeah, I can look at this now and realize the twist isn't really earned and that games have done much better. But the combination of being an impressionable young kid and video game stories never reaching beyond basic, I can still find some wonder in it as a relic. Maybe the story doesn't exactly hold up as good storytelling in 2021, but it did help push video game stories forward, and I can appreciate that just as much as I did the twists in the late 80s, early 90s. And because of the Pixel remasters, I finally was able to beat the game on my own almost 25 years later. And while I know the Pixel remasters have their detractors, I am immensely grateful for the chance to play this classic. I tried a while ago with Final Fantasy Origins, released for the original PlayStation, but the lack of MP bothered me. And while I made it pretty far into the game, I never was able to beat it. For those that don't know, the original Final Fantasy is a tweaked version of Dungeons & Dragons rules for magic, meaning you had a certain number of casts for spells by level rather than a pool of magic points you could use to cast any spell any number of times until your magic points ran out. Since I recently played through Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, the magic system wasn't nearly as alien to me this time around. The most pleasant surprise of the Pixel remasters was the music. Nobuo Uematsu has been rightly celebrated for his instantly classic video game scores, but the original Nintendo Entertainment System obviously didn't have the technology to go much beyond the beeps and boops. And while the limitations of the system are part of the magic of Uematsu's work, I loved hearing the remastered versions. They were able to keep the original's catchiness, but add beauty. Here's a few of my favorites. Matoya's Cave would later be reworked into possibly my favorite song of the entire Final Fantasy series, but we won't get to that for a while. In writing this, I was able to realize Final Fantasy I's true impact on me. I was enamored with the game when I first watched my friend play, but I also wanted it to be so much more. I recognized it for how much it did right, while still being able to pick out the wasted potential. And to this day, I'm much more intrigued to read and watch criticism of things I like than I am to read criticism about the things with little to no redeeming value, though that can certainly be fun at times. It's probably why I never understood the backlash from gamers towards feminist game criticism. If you love games, why wouldn't you want them to be even better and resonate with more people? At some point between 10 and 13 years old, I don't remember exactly when I watched Rob play, I started to think critically about video games. Not just the mechanics, gameplay, and plot, but theme and character. I'm not saying that tween me would have been wondering why the princess's role in games was always to get kidnapped, and that Final Fantasy the series jumpstarts with that exact trope. Tween me probably thought that's just what princesses did, and it was up to me, the man, to save them, which, yeah, that's the problem. Instead, I wondered why a game couldn't craft actual personalities for the characters you play. You were going to spend quite a bit of time on an epic quest with these people, so you might as well get to know them. I wanted to see relationship dynamics between characters, not just romantic, but platonic, adversarial, familial. And while part of me mourns my inability to fill the blanks like I could as a child, I also know that dynamically created characters and planned relationships can have a real power on how I consume the adventure. I much prefer the romantic relationships of Zidane and Garnet, or Geralt and Triss, or Yen, I guess, because they feel like true written, planned romances, not a series of inputs that nets you a sex scene as in the Mass Effect or countless other games with romance involved. Even at that young age, I saw the potential of games as stories. I didn't like the Dragonlance novels because of the plot, at times generic and way too convenient, but because of the characters. Tannis Half-Elven, Goldmoon, Flint Fireforge, Raceland, and Cameron Majeur. I could keep going, but the point is, I loved fantasy because of the people who went on the adventures, not just the adventures themselves. In video games, I saw a chance to not just take part in the adventure, but to take on the roles of the characters. And this was a chance I felt ignored by Final Fantasy. I get why. Final Fantasy was a passion project, and putting the extra hours into character development was probably a risk Square was unwilling to take. Or maybe they just didn't have the memory for the extra text needed. Luckily, though, they would get a second chance, and a third, and so on. And I can't wait to revisit those chances, or in some cases, visit for the first time.